Welcome to Chats with Changemakers, the Northeast podcast for people who want to make the world a better place. Hello and welcome to Chats with Changemakers. I'm your host, Kate Duffy. In this episode, I interviewed Guy Pilkington of the charity Ways to Wellness. In this conversation, Guy shares his journey from being a GP to becoming the charity chair. Ways to Wellness focuses on improving health outcomes through non-medical interventions. So let's hear from Guy. Hi, Guy, and welcome to Chats with Changemakers. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today.
It's a pleasure. I feel a bit of a fraud in that, are we ever really change makers? But I'll do my best to justify the label.
Okay.
But please caveat it with a huge amount of doubt about how much I've contributed to any meaningful change.
Okay, well, we'll check that out by the end of this conversation.
Yeah.
Sure. So tell us, Guy, what is it that makes you a change maker? What inspired you to do something different?
Well, my working career was as a general practitioner in the health service, and I worked in Crudders Park in Newcastle, which, if you know Newcastle well enough, you'll know is an area where people live who have probably least in our society. So working in an area like that, it was very clear to me that there were limitations to what any medicine could do for the problems that people were presenting with. So I always had a keen interest in other things that made a difference to people's lives other than the tablets that they took or what their blood pressure was. And if you have a keen interest in that, you do ask yourself the question, how do we make more difference? How do we contribute more to supporting people who have least to cope and take control and have real influence on the opportunities that they and their families face? So that's what took me to this area, really.
Interesting. And so what were the next steps for you? You've identified a need.
Yeah.
What happened? How did you decide to take that forward?
Well, I think and none of this was conscious. This was all, very much just felt like the thing that I wanted to do and found most satisfying. The first thing I think was find people who think like you do. And some very, very influential people in my early days as a GP emerged. I had trained at a practice where my trainer was Chris Drinkwater, who became Professor Chris Drinkwater after he moved away from general practice. And he and I have had 30 years of conversations and shared interests. And Ways to Wellness, the charitable foundation which I now chair, was essentially Chris's creation, but he, I'm not going to be overly humble on this one. I was very important to the creation of Ways to Wellness in my role as a general practitioner and a commissioner with what was called the Clinical Commissioning Group at the time. So it was Chris and many other people who inspired me to continue to think about how we made a difference beyond the realms of medicine itself in the traditional sense, and to think about all the other things that influence people's lives and their well-being. And by doing that, I found I was part of a community of interest, if you like, that was able to support each other to do some things.
You've mentioned it's a charity. What kind of stuff do you deliver? What activities or services do you provide?
It was created back in 2014, 2015 with a primary purpose back then of demonstrating what impact could large-scale support for people living with the common medical, what we call long-term conditions, the chronic diseases of modern day life, diabetes, heart disease, asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the big and very common conditions that people had. Could we improve people's outcomes and their health and well-being if we offered them routinely non-medical support, which has been stuck with the label of social prescribing? And at that time, it was done all over the place, but in small scale, and nobody had really done it as a routine offer at large scale in the way that we did. Now, I take no credit for the fact that we gave it a go, but I was part of the clinical commissioning group that allowed Ways to Wellness to give it a go on our behalf, if you like. And, to give you some idea of the scale that we were aiming for, we identified in the west of Newcastle 14,000 people.
Wow.
Who could be eligible for this support. And after lots and lots of complicated conversations and negotiations, the commissioners gave a 7-year contract to Ways to Wellness, unusual in terms of the length of the contract, an outcomes-based contract, so we would pay based on the evidence that it was having impact, and we agreed that the support could be long-term for people, up to 2 years, and the average for people that they were involved with our link workers was 19 months. People definitely took up the offer of long-term support. And we were able, through this rather complicated commissioning and finance arrangement, to demonstrate the kind of impacts it was having for those 14,000 people. 10 years later, 11,000 of the 14,000 had been given the opportunity to engage in support. Wow. So we did it at scale that nobody else had done before. And that for me was the genesis of what Ways to Wellness has now become, because as I've retired from my commissioning role and retired from general practice, I was invited to take over from Chris in terms of chairing the charitable foundation, which I now do. And as a charitable foundation, we take the idea that there are non-medical ways of making big differences to people's outcomes and to reaching people who could do with support that traditional health services sometimes struggle to connect with. We take that idea and we work with people within local authorities, within health services, within communities, to try and explore new avenues of support that can make a real difference. And there are a number of projects running at the moment that Ways to Wellness is responsible for.
It's incredible. I'm wondering, Guy, can you give us an example of a non-medical intervention? Like what are we talking about here?
Yeah. So if we go back to the original idea, if you are living with diabetes, for example, the health service is very, very good at offering you things that are well-evidenced medical interventions, which range from complicated injections and tablets and regimes to improve your long-term outcome with diabetes, but also extend to education programs, which have been well evidenced to make a huge difference to how well people do, because they have a degree of confidence and a degree of knowledge that makes a huge difference to how they cope. But particularly in my practice, people living in areas of significant deprivation, all of that may not be the most important thing that's going on in their lives. It may be the fact that they're living in substandard housing or are at threat of eviction because of rent arrears, or they have precarious employment or none. And these things are massively important to how people look after themselves. Mm-hmm. If you are not in a good state of mind and feeling a degree of agency, well, that education course, which really makes a huge difference to how you look after yourself, may not be something that you can easily engage with. So the idea was, if we offer people's a link worker, somebody who may well come from the West End of Newcastle and may well be somebody that sounds and looks familiar to them because they're not steeped in the professionalism that health professionals and others have, if you can offer them support that feels very, very dedicated to you and your problems, you can begin to change those circumstances. And it might be around good welfare, support, support to cope with the risk of eviction, a conversation with the landlord to sort out the debt problem, and so on, using the professionals that are available around, welfare rights workers, housing support officers. But if that individual, your link worker, has spent time with you working out what those challenges are and giving you the confidence that there are ways that you can change that, then you can be taken from a position of, not to over-egg it, a sense of hopelessness to a position where you feel, actually, with this support, I can do something about this now. So you start with what the problem is as the individual sees it. And from there, you can get to a position where looking after your diabetes becomes something that you do want to do much more actively, because these other problems have become less overwhelming.
It's amazing. So it's a real holistic approach to an individual. It isn't just targeting the one thing that's within a box. It's looking at the person entirely. That's really interesting. I wonder, in terms of, this isn't one of the questions that we spoke about in advance, but I'm wondering, how do you measure that impact? Because I know lots of people in the Changemakers community work towards well-being outcomes, and it's something that can be really tricky, because once people are feeling better, they might not want to engage with a questionnaire, or a questionnaire might be really inappropriate. So how do you track that to make sure that the assumed impact that sounds very logical and sensible is actually happening?
Very good question. And I think one of the unique things about Ways to Wellness has been how rigorously it undertook that challenge. The decision was taken that we would use something called an outcome star from Trinity Publishing. And the outcome star has 8 points on the star, and they are self-evaluated degrees of well-being on a number of points. There was relationships, housing, finances, confidence in looking after yourself, and so on. Eight questions that you self-evaluated, and people have been tracked continuously to see how they are doing using that star. And we were able to demonstrate very significant improvements across the board with individuals on that. But when we first set the contract for this large-scale version of link work or social prescribing, not unreasonably, I was chairing the commissioning group at the time. We had a budget, which, as you can imagine, has always been the case in the NHS, is stretched. And not unreasonably, we said, well, if we want to invest in this large-scale new way of working, we've got to kind of be able to convince ourselves pretty convincingly that we're saving money by doing this. We are creating a budget for this investment because we're spending a little bit of money less elsewhere. And so we set up a comparison group with other people, 11,000 people in the rest of Newcastle with similar conditions, with similar levels of deprivation, with similar age profiles. And we tracked how much we were spending on 14,000 people in the western Newcastle and 11,000 people in the other parts of Newcastle. And we followed them for, well, it all went a bit difficult when the pandemic arrived. So we followed them for 5-6 years. Wow. As cohorts, and we were able to show that there was a difference being generated by our intervention. And although we were spending more every year, because you do in the health service, things become more expensive and the activity levels rise, it was growing faster in the rest of Newcastle than it was with our 14,000 people, to some very significant numbers. By the end of year 5, we were able to demonstrate that, there was £1.5 million difference between what we were spending on hospital-based activity for our group compared to the comparator group.
That's huge.
So yeah, it was huge, and it was unexpectedly huge. There was considerable skepticism amongst colleagues and other people working in commissioning that we could possibly do that. As far as I know, nobody had ever really demonstrated that kind of level of impact, and the reason we could do that was because of the huge scale of what was created. So, we set a very high bar. We'll do this with you. This is me talking as a commissioner and my colleagues, loads of really important colleagues. And I do want to give a shout out to our finance director, Joe Corrigan, and his team, because this was not usual activity for health commissioners to be doing. So we all had to stick our necks out collectively to do this. It was a brave and unusual thing to do, but we set the bar really high. Show us that this investment that we're making is one, helping people, the outcome star, if you like, but two, helping us in terms of our budget constraints. So, tell us that we're saving something elsewhere, and the savings were achieved and surpassed in a way that we had not expected.
And firstly, congratulations on such an enormous success. And I'm intrigued then as to what the ripple effect is. So has this best practice been shared nationwide? Is it something now that's continuing to be rolled out across the Northeast? Is it something that's been done elsewhere?
Well, it contributed to a national change for sure. So social prescribing link work has become part of routine practice within the health service, not at large scale, but pretty universally. So general practices have been corralled into groups called primary care commissioning groups, and these primary care networks. These primary care networks are given budgets to create new roles, one of which is social prescribing link workers. And I think particularly in areas looking after deprived communities, I think general practice primary care networks have adopted the model and they have been seen to be extremely useful. Maybe not at the same scale of routine offer that we were attempting to make with people living with long-term conditions, but it definitely contributed to the evidence base that gave the NHS as a whole the confidence to create this new way of working as a routine offer. We've had a little, there is definitely influence and change happening within our region as well, but it has been a struggle to roll it out in the way that we imagined it might take place. And I think that has partly been the pandemic got in the way of our progress collectively and locally. And then the continual reorganisation of the health service, despite whatever the secretaries of state for health say, we're not going to have another top-down reorganisation. That's exactly what the health service has been living with. That has created real turbulence in the system that has made our ability to promote the rollout regionally and locally quite a lot. And I think we've been less successful in sustaining and rolling out the idea than we would have liked.
Okay. And is that something that you think is going to continue, or are we heading towards the end of that transition phase where hopefully things can pick back up?
Yes, we're beginning to move to a steady state, if you like, with another shift in the locus of decision making, the locus of control within the health service. And these ideas won't go away. They'll still be around. And, we have absolute conviction and optimism that we'll be able to continue working in this way with health service colleagues once everything has settled and new opportunities arise. And they're arising all the time. There are grants coming out from central government for areas to innovate in one way or another. And so there are always opportunities.
And I wonder, thinking ahead to the future, what's in store for you guys? Is it depth of impact here in the Northeast, or is it breadth of impact across the whole of the UK or the world? What's on your site?
We absolutely see ourselves as a Northeast, not a Newcastle organisation. So although our greatest success was created within Newcastle, we've worked across the Northeast and North Cumbria. We've had a very successful project where local organisations have been supported by Ways to Wellness teams to support women who are pregnant and struggling with their mental health, the Maternal Mental Health Project, which was run in 4 areas across the Northeast and produced lots of great evidence of how this model works there. And we do see ourselves as a Northeast organisation. We love having chats with people who are running the national level, because whatever is happening there is needed more in the Northeast almost than anywhere else in the country because of the nature of our region, and will always be open to national level conversations. But we do think that really our place is the Northeast.
I'm just thinking back to where we started our conversation, Guy, and you were saying that you weren't sure that the term changemaker was right. And I'm just thinking that the path that you've taken through this as a commissioner, taking that risk and being brave to support this organisation to trial this really groundbreaking approach, and then later on now supporting that organisation through this challenge of changes that are going on with the health service and into continued impact. I kind of can't think of another word to describe what it is that you've done there. I think it's amazing. What do you see as
I
your
think
role?
I've been involved in a set of amazing things. I have absolutely no doubt. However, I think there are 2 aspects. I think none of that would have happened without the most fantastic bunch of people working alongside. So at most, my contribution has been just a small part in a much bigger change, if you like. But I think the thing that tempers my pride in being part of that process has been exactly the question you were just asking. How's the rollout going? Because I don't think we've changed the culture or the system nearly as much as we should have done. And I think there are mitigating reasons why we didn't achieve more of that I've already mentioned. But for me, there continues to be a degree of disappointment that we haven't influenced more and more widely. There is a problem when great ideas like ours, which I think it is a great idea, are taken by people at national level because they often get the wrong end of the stick and come up with their own version of something that maybe misses the point. And I think there are elements of that have gone on. I think the routine offer of social prescribing to the primary care networks hasn't come in exactly the way that we would have designed it. And I think that creates a certain degree of risk, if you like. But also, I think the NHS, people talk about it being a juggernaut that's, really difficult to change direction of this juggernaut. And I think that's absolutely true. I think the health service still has a long way to go to rise to the challenge of what we think we've been able to demonstrate. And that for me is a frustration. I can see that we've made a change, and I know we've made a difference to an enormous number of people's lives, but I worry that the change is still too small to have the real impacts that I would hope both across the region and nationally. And the NHS continues to have a culture that I think is not immediately able to absorb these ideas.
These big systematic changes certainly take time.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that kind of brings us nicely, I think, onto the last question for you today, Guy, which is hopefully we've got lots of wonderful change makers all working at different themes, different sectors, different levels. What can we do to help you? What can we do to support your mission to actually get those systematic changes to have the big impact that you want to have?
Well, one of the things I do believe strongly about change is perseverance is kind of obligatory if you want to see any change, because nothing ever changes as quickly as we'd want. And therefore, you have to be banging the drum again and again and again, repeatedly, to the same people, to different people, and so on. That's one thing. So if you're out there and you spend the odd evening wondering whether you're making a difference or not, don't stop. Work with the courage of your convictions, regardless of how slow things are. And I think if anybody out there is working with the health service, you'll know exactly what I mean by how frustrating it can be. So don't stop. That's the first thing. The second thing is there is power in the collective, isn't there? And we as an organisation are very, very open to partnership working, very keen on partnership working. We don't believe we have the answers, but we believe that we're willing to work together on the questions. And if there's anything that I've said today that appeals to you in terms of our philosophy at Ways to Wellness, then do get in touch. We may well have something we could work on together. We're open to conversations with people across the sectors, both statutory and clearly voluntary sectors, community sectors very much. So perseverance, collaboration, and strong relationships. I think the thing that we learnt in our original project for people with long-term conditions in the Western Newcastle was what made a difference to people was feeling that they had a relationship with an individual link worker that was meaningful to them. But when we wrote the contract, we were never going to be able to build something unless we were willing to accept that we, the commissioners, would love this thing to succeed. And you, Ways to Wellness organisation, in its first form then, also want it to work. So let's work together and let's not beat each other up about the challenges that we face, because we'll achieve more if we are working together, a relational approach, if you like, to building something. And so at the individual level, but also the organizational level, relationships for me are absolutely key, rather than, the key performance indicators or the Gantt chart and so on. And most things can be overcome if you hit, bumps in the road, if you have trust and faith that the people you're working with want the same thing as you do. And we as an organization are very, very open to close relationships, strong partnership working, and would love to hear from people who think that we might have something to offer.
Wonderful. Well, Guy, there's some absolute pearls of wisdom in there, as well as a brilliant call to action for us to end on. So thank you ever so much for your time, and we'll catch up with you again soon, I'm sure.
Great. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.
I found my chat with Guy really interesting. As an individual, as well as part of an organisation, he's played a really important role to helping us understand how to better support people to achieve wellness beyond medical interventions. I thought it was really interesting that he struggled with the term change maker, but take the point that he was part of a bigger collective team that made all of this possible. But in my opinion, he's very much an important change maker as part of this organisation. I really liked his key points at the end. So there were kind of three things that I took away from that conversation. Number one was perseverance. So not expecting your sensible, logical answer to a problem to be achieved in a really clear, clean, straight line, but rather being prepared to get up after the knocks and keep going and being really steadfast in your mission. I think that's really important to hold on to. The second was around good relationships. The fact as a commissioner and now as a chair of the charity that he initially commissioned, I think that's such an interesting experience that Guy's had, because he can see both sides of that table. It's really important to have those good working relationships with commissioners where we're all working towards the same goal. We're all wanting this to be successful. So how do we best utilise our expertise and our resources to make that possible? That isn't, sadly, the case all of the time with commissioning opportunities, but a really good example of best practice there. And the last point, I think, was more around the conviction, being courageous in your conviction. So if you know this is the right thing that is needed to affect positive change on the topic or the theme that you are working towards, you need to find a way to do it. The world is going to continuously change around you. Funding opportunities are going to move. The landscape is going to change. But if your approach is right, you need to be courageous in that and find a way through. So thank you very much, Guy, for your time. I found it really interesting to hear about your experiences. And to you wonderful viewers, don't forget to subscribe to Chats with Changemakers for more brilliant interviews like this one. You can also join our free North East Changemakers community to connect directly with more people like Guy. Catch you next time. If you've been inspired by what you've heard today, come and join our free North East Changemakers community to meet like-minded people and start your journey to changing the world.